much. Good afternoon to the ministers, to GCIS, and to all the members of the media. As Minister Gumela has introduced the matter, what has happened is that the President last night announced the termination of the national state of disaster. And that was done last night. That does not mean the end of the pandemic. The pandemic is still there. What it means is that it is at such a level that it can be managed without using the Disaster Management Act. It no longer qualifies as a disaster, but it's still there. So it means that it has to be managed by normal legislation, not the Disaster Management Act, because the Disaster Management Act cannot be used permanently. It's a temporary, it's of temporary use. So we have exited now the national state of disaster. But obviously, since the pandemic is still there, we needed to introduce transitional measures which are allowed by the Disaster Management Act, which are post-disaster measures. So what those post-disaster management and rehabilitation measures are is that we should still continue wearing masks for at least another 30 days indoors, in gatherings indoors. Outdoors, it's not necessary, but in gatherings indoors, we still need to do that. But we still, and health will also expand on why we did that. We also still need to limit the number of people in gatherings. So we continue with the 1,000 indoors and 2,000 outdoors at 1 meter apart. And of course, indoors they will wear masks, but there are no other requirements. You don't have to produce the vaccine or the test. There's a vaccine certificate on the test, but if you want to go beyond 1,000 indoors, you can go up to 50% of the venue. But if it's more than 1,000, then you have to have a gathering of people who are either vaccinated and they can show a vaccine certificate, or can show a test that's not more than 72 hours old. And that is for 1 month, 30 days. And of course, the borders that are open will continue being open, but people coming in from will have to either show a vaccine certificate or a PCR test that is not more than 72 hours. Then there are other transitional arrangements. You will recall that because of the unemployment that has been exacerbated by the COVID, there was a grant of 350 that's being paid. So that grant will continue. So we're just transitioning that through these transitional arrangements for 30 days, but beyond that, it will continue through other legislation. And of course, there's been a big backlog of renewal of driver's licenses and applying for new ones. and that will also continue for that period, and then hopefully by then the normal procedures will be followed. And then the third and last one is the no-fault compensation for those people who may have adverse effects or be sick or something from the vaccine, so that you can apply for the compensation, and that process will continue, but that one will continue beyond the national state of disaster, because as long as people are being vaccinated, they should be able to have that access to the no-fault compensation. So, but from the Disaster Management Act, these will only continue for the next 30 days. After that, they will lapse. And we will then go back to normal, except that legislation from the different sectors will then take on when necessary. But it also means that if the pandemic were to escalate and reach a level where it becomes a disaster, the Disaster Management Act can still be utilized. So if we look after ourselves, wear masks, and make sure that we do what needs to be done, wash our hands and all that, we may avoid a situation where this pandemic becomes a disaster again, and that's what we're hoping for. But in the event it becomes a disaster, we will have to bring back the Management Act.